Welcome. This is an introduction to the Understanding by Design template. And first, we're going to start just kind of giving you an overview of what Understanding by Design is. And basically, it is a way for an instructor to plan the unit, or it could be also an entire course, backwards. So essentially, it is basically a way to kind of help them plan what it is they're going to teach, how the students are going to engage with the content, and then also how they're going to assess the students based on the goals and objectives that they set. So Understanding by Design has 3 stages, and the first one, as you see here, is identify desired results. So basically, as we go through this, um, the first page of stage 1 is basically just an overview of the topic, the course, how long you're going to be actually teaching this class, and then also how long the unit will be. Um, it's basically a lot of information that you would find on a course syllabus, but it does have places for, you can see the textbook, online resources, things like that. But what we're going to focus on here is the specific unit. This is at the bottom of page 5. And in this case, I'm actually going to use an example of something that I did. And the unit that I've chosen was fitness testing for students with disabilities. This is something that I plan to teach in an assessment class for adapted physical education teachers. And so within this assessment class, it's a 7-week class. I plan to have 1 week or one class period where we're going to essentially go over the fitness testing, give them information, show videos, things like that to help them to use the FitnessGram and Brockport physical fitness tests for the students they teach who have disabilities in their classes. This is something that I had planned in week 2 of 7 weeks, and this is an online class that I'll be doing. So you see here you have options to click face-to-face if it's blended where you go back and forth, or online. Moving on, you have a unit overview. And in this case, basically, this is just a brief summary or description of what is going to be covered in the unit. So you can see there what it is that I'm planning to do with my students in this case. But in this case, you can see that it does say to use simple words. So basically, this is a description that hopefully anybody could understand. So the purpose of this fitness testing unit is to provide learners with the basic knowledge they will need to use the Brockport physical fitness test with their students who are unable to complete traditional fitness testing activities. Learners will be introduced to the different test items in the Brockport physical fitness test, and will learn which test items are appropriate based on the student's abilities and characteristics of the disability. And then I also added in a little bit later the physical fitness test called FitnessGram as well, only because some students with disabilities are actually able to complete FitnessGram, which is designed for people without disabilities. And that just means that these students may not have any sort of limitations, and they're able to complete fitness testing just as anybody else would be. The next section covers the content standards or competencies. So in this case, I've chosen APENS, which is the Adapted Physical Education National Standards, and I've chosen standards 4 and 8 that essentially fit what it is that I'm doing. So they talk about measurement, evaluation, and assessment. And then I also chose some Ohio adapted physical education standards for an endorsement program because that's what my students are going to be teaching. So you can see the 2 standards I have there. And then I've also included one for technology where in this case, my students being the teachers will be using technology to help them assess and evaluate their students. So the next component of stage 1 is called transfer. And essentially transfer is something that really is the main goal of what it is that we do as teachers to help our students be able to apply something that they've learned in our class into a different situation. And so, I could give an example where, I could sit here and practice passing a soccer ball to a wall for, days and days and days and be great at that. But throw me into a soccer game, does that actually mean that I'm going to be able to use that skill in a game where, I'm moving, the ball's going to be coming from somebody who passed it to me. They may also be moving. There will be defenders. There will be very different situations and strategies and things like that that I would need to be able to choose the right option in that case. And so that's the goal of transfer, is to help students to use the information that we've learned or that they've learned and put it into a different context. So in this case, for what I'm hoping to do, I'm hoping that my students essentially will be able to use these fitness tests appropriately for the kids with disabilities. Again, FitnessGram might be something that would work for students with disabilities, or it may not. And so, since I'm not there, I need to teach my students how to figure that out. And so, they need to know each of the tests, each of the test items, and they really need to be able to say whether or not that fitness test item is going to be appropriate for a student with a disability. And if it's not, then they need to be able to pick an alternative that would be appropriate. Um, and then that last transfer goal, I'm looking to basically what my students need to be able to do then, based on the screening, the assessments, and things that they do. They also need to be able to make decisions according to fitness testing scores and other test scores as well, in terms of whether the student should be in a regular physical education class or an adapted physical education class. And again, these are things that, we could learn the information in class, but they're going to need to be able to transfer it and apply it into a different setting, which is their actual school setting. So that's essentially what transfer is. The next component is meaning. And this is basically broken down into two different categories. And so you have essential questions, and these are things that are really going to ask the students to think deeply, to really make meaning of what it is that we've taught, and then also to transfer it to, again, to these different situations or settings. And so, again, some of these are kind of basic in terms of, which tests or test items are appropriate for students with disabilities. Well, a lot of these test items, when you actually look at the manual, they have specific, characteristics. They list the requirements that people need to be able to do in order to do these fitness test items appropriately, things like that. So, that may or may not be a very hard thing to do in that case. But the thing that we need to consider is that every child with a disability is different. So again, this is where they need to transfer the knowledge that they have of disabilities, and things that they've learned in other classes into this setting where they're working with, kids who have disabilities in their own classrooms. So, these questions, again, these are questions to just get the students to start thinking more in depth, getting them to essentially, again, transfer the knowledge that they've learned and put it into practice. The second component of this meaning section is understandings. And, basically this is, like it says, what do we want the students to be able to know or understand? So in this case, you essentially just list everything that you want the students to understand. So I'll just pick the third one, where students will understand how to use computer software such as FitnessGram and Microsoft Excel to compile fitness test data. And so, this is something that at the end of the unit, they're going to be able to do this because we've gone over it. So again, the understandings are coming out of the unit, what it is that you want them to have knowledge of. And one other thing is what's important here too, if you look to the right where it says competency codes, you need to tie these essential questions, the transfer, the understandings, things like that, to the standards that you've chosen. So the standards that you have picked and you have deemed appropriate for your unit, they need to tie to each and every one of these things. So essentially you can say, yes, I'm, focusing on these standards and here's how I'm doing that. And then the codes on the left, this is something where you'll see in stage 2, but basically you're giving each one of these understandings, questions, transfer, skills, all those things. You're giving each one of them a code that will be a lot easier than just rewriting everything in stage 2. So the next component then is acquisition, and this is broken down into knowledge and skills. So as an instructor, as a professor, one of the things that I have to do is list all the cognitive things that my students are going to be able to do coming out of my class. And then I also need to list the skills. So in this case, your knowledge is going to be the cognitive things, or definitions, using just Microsoft Excel. That could be something that's pretty basic if you've used it before, or it could be completely foreign if somebody's never used it. So, how to write fitness test scores as present levels of performance. I mean, these are things that the students need to be able to know. A lot of these things could be assessed by taking a written test, something like that. But if you look at the knowledge number 1, where it says students will know which test to use for a specific student based on the characteristics and needs of that student. So this is not necessarily something that can be assessed in a written test. So, again, they're going to need to know the characteristics of the student. They're going to need to know the test items from both fitness tests. So again, you can kind of see where this knowledge ties in. And then skills will be, as it says, things that our students are going to be skilled at. So again, coming out of this unit, they are going to be skilled at, creating score sheets. They're going to be skilled at interpreting fitness test results, at using FitnessGram and Brockport physical fitness tests, and using them appropriately for the students with disabilities. So these are all things that essentially our students are going to be able to do, where knowledge is things they're going to be able to know. Skills relate to what they're going to be able to do. So then at the end of stage 1, and you'll see this also goes for stages 2 and 3 as well, you have a self-check. And, basically what this is kind of just a review of each of the different components of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, where you have the opportunity to really reflect and think about what you've created, and then look at maybe places where you feel like you excelled and were above expectation. Or you could see for number 4, I wasn't exactly sure where, when I described the standards, if I needed to include more there or not. And so this I did for a class, but if I were to do this for my own unit, what I had would have been sufficient. And then the next part is a peer evaluation. So you can have the opportunity for a peer to go through and essentially do the exact same thing, where they review all the different components that you did, and then they give you feedback. And so, this would be probably more helpful if you're using a peer who knows your content, because if you don't know the content, it's very hard to know if they've covered everything, in enough depth, and then to also offer helpful suggestions. So having somebody who is a peer that knows your content would be very, very helpful. Stage 2 is where you determine your acceptable evidence. And so you can see here on the left, you have all the different codes. So the transfer, the essential questions, understandings. So all of those things are going to relate to the different tasks that you design. And so stage 2 is essentially creating your assessment tasks, things that you want the students to be able to do in order to learn the information that you present to them. And so for this one, again, remember, I only have just 1 week. So there's very limited time that I had to create a bunch of different things for the students to do. So my big assignment, or my big task here, is where my students are actually going to go and create a fitness test for a student with a disability, implement the test. They're going to input the data, or the all the data that they get from the fitness test into either FitnessGram or Microsoft Excel, create a report, and then from that report, they'll be able to write a present level of performance, so what the student is able to do based on their current level of fitness, and then also to help them make placement decisions for that student. So this is a pretty big project, and that's why I didn't, because it's only a 7-week class, I didn't have a whole lot of things that I wanted my students to be able to do. Some other things, the second part is other evidence. So these are things where they're going to be more knowledge-based. They're not necessarily going to be a performance task where they're required to actually implement something. So, I have multiple choice tests, short answer exams. I love short answer exams, probably more so than multiple choice because it shows me that my students understand a little bit better than being able to pick the right answer. You have your case study where in this case, they basically have to, based on, maybe I'll give them a fake student with a disability and list the different characteristics and kind of give an overview of what this child is able to do. And then they should be able to look through their book and pick different test items and things like that for that child, to where they start becoming more and more familiar with the test items and what's appropriate for what disability or specific characteristics, things like that. And then the last one, data collection and use of technology. So, in that case, that's something where they're going to be using the Microsoft Excel program or the FitnessGram program to create a report for their students with disabilities. And then the last component here in stage 2 is a grading rubric. And grading rubrics are nice because essentially they are designed as something that you would hand out to your students. So they have it ahead of time. They know what's expected of them. They know what they need to do in order to get an exemplary score. And you can see here this rubric has 4 different levels. So you have your criterion on the left, which is essentially the item that you're going to be grading them on. And then the 4 different levels go from exemplary, which is above average, sufficient is about average, needs revision, maybe below average, and then no evidence, meaning they didn't show you any evidence that they actually did that component. So just to kind of go over one example here, we have my first criterion is test items are chosen based on student needs and abilities. And so, here I list 5 to 7 appropriate fitness test items. And that's only because in fitness testing, you're testing body composition, muscular strength, muscular endurance, flexibility, and aerobic fitness. So, that's 5 things right there that you're testing. So, they need to cover all the different components of health-related fitness. And for the Brockport physical fitness test, they suggest about 7 to 8 different items for a student with a disability. So, in this case, 5 to 7, it gives you a range. It doesn't have a hard and fast number that they need to include because, again, every student is different. So 5 to 7, and then making sure also that the items are appropriate for the student. Then sufficient is they only included 3 or 4. Some of them, most are appropriate, maybe not all. And then needs revision, fewer than 3 are appropriate, or maybe they're not applicable to the student's needs or abilities. And then the last one would be either there's no evidence provided that they even chose any test items, which would kind of mean they didn't even do the project, or the test items were not appropriate for the student based on his or her needs. So you can kind of see here, in terms of criterion, there's not a specific number of criterion that you need. It's just kind of based on you and the assignment and how you've set it up. So, I chose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things, but you could include more, you could have less. For me, I just picked all the main components that I wanted and went from there. So, one thing that you do want to make sure is that you don't have multiple criterion in each box. So, for example, I have the decision on the placement. So it's not decision on the placement and writing a present level of performance because, in this case, what if the student did one thing but not the other? It would be very hard to pick a specific level that would be appropriate. So you want to make sure that you only have one criterion in each box. And that's why I said you could put more, you could put less. It just depends on what's actually appropriate for you. And then you also have your self-check again here. So you can see the areas where I thought I did okay, but I wasn't, I wasn't exactly sure. I didn't know maybe where I was going, but this was probably my favorite stage because it really kind of puts things together. You set your goals, you have all these things you want your students to understand, and you do all that in stage one. But stage two is where you kind of start designing your tasks. And, for me, I like to be creative and I like to assess my students in as many different ways as possible and to make these things as realistic and as helpful as possible. So, again, going back to this performance task that I've designed, I tried to make this something that was as relevant to them as I could. Again, it helps with the transfer. It helps them understand what it is that they need to do. It helps them to learn the different test items. I mean, in my opinion, this encompasses everything that I want them to get out of the fitness testing unit. And so that's why it's one big project. And then one other thing that I didn't mention, here on the right, you have your evaluative criteria. And this is basically, the things that you're going to do or use to evaluate your students. And so, each of these things, you see I have 5 different things here. And then these are the criteria that I actually added down into the rubric. So again, when I was talking about the different criterion, these are the different criterion here. So then we just kind of expanded on each of these. So the first, choosing appropriate test items. So as we go back down here to the rubric, this is where you have on the left side your test items are chosen. So that's where that transfers down into the grading rubric. And you could also use grading rubrics, not as much for tests, but something like a case study, different data collection things, you could write a rubric for that. And again, they are very helpful because students know exactly what's required of them. But at the same time, a rubric, and in this case, I just said 5 to 7 appropriate items. I didn't say, you needed to pick 5 items and these are the ones you need to pick. I left it open to the students to, be creative, to think about what's appropriate for the kids that they work with. And so it doesn't stifle their creativity or their thought process. It encourages them to think, but they know that they need to have at least 5 to 7, and in some cases more might be appropriate as well. But 5 to 7 is a good number. So a grading rubric, you have to be careful. You don't want it to be so specific that basically students just go through and list everything that you've got. You want them to think on their own, and so that's why I kind of left it open to foster creativity in my students. So we talked about that. Then you have your peer feedback again, which is essentially the exact same thing as the self-assessment. And then we move on to stage 3. And stage 3 is essentially your learning experiences and what it is that you're going to do in order to help your students learn. And so, in this case, they call it the Where To acronym. And so basically each of those letters stands for something in this third stage. So the W is, as you see on the left side, kind of helping the students understand what's expected of them, why this is an important unit, where the unit is going. So again, what they're going to learn, what's expected of them. So the first thing you have are your goals. And you write that in the form of a learning objective. And as a teacher, we always teach our students to write learning objectives where you say students will be able to, and then you list the skill or the activity that they're going to be able to do. And then you have your criterion. They need to be measurable. It needs to be something that's done in a reasonable time frame. So again, thinking that I only have this 1 week out of 7 to really go over the information about fitness testing, I could have them, probably more than likely what's going to happen, and I haven't taught this class yet, but more than likely what will happen is at the end of the class time, so at the end of that 7 weeks, that big project that I showed you in stage 2 will be their end of the semester project instead of, having them do it just in 1 week and being done with it. This gives them plenty of time to kind of plan out the assessment, and, it is a time consuming project. And so, having them do it in just 1 week is not going to be reasonable. So you have your learning objectives. And again, this is just 1 week. So I didn't have a whole lot of learning objectives written because I don't have a whole lot of time to cover these things. So, I do have a written exam. More than likely that could be a midterm exam, but it's not just going to be on fitness testing. It'll be on other types of assessment like motor skill testing, cognitive testing, those types of things as well. Relevance. So, again, here, this is just kind of talking about why they're doing this. So, why is this important to them? And so, one of the things that I like is to kind of help the students to kind of write out what it is that they know, what they want to know, and then afterward figure out what they actually learned. Okay, so that's the KWL. So, what do you know? What do you want to know? And then what did you learn? And so, in this case, they can kind of see where they started. And then, from that, it helps me design my unit because I know what they want to learn. And then at the end, they'll, be able to revisit it and reflect and see what it is that they actually did learn. But you can see how this is, just kind of teaching them how this is relevant, why this is important, all of those things. So this is the W. Diagnosis. Again, this is figuring out what they know, so giving them a pretest on the content or test items. I could also just say, okay, go out and fitness test somebody without actually teaching the fitness test, and have them just say, oh my gosh, this is a lot harder than I thought. Because it is. It's not something that's easily done. You really have to think about it and plan it out, and you need to know the test pretty well in order to be successful at actually implementing the test. The H in where to is hook and hold. So basically, this is catching your students' interest and keeping it throughout the unit. And so, showing videos, giving them case studies, having them test themselves, anything here to catch their attention and to essentially, help them to become interested in what it is that I'm going to do. And, in my case, our students, or at least our physical education teachers in the state of Ohio, have to assess their students. And so this is something that's very relevant to them. It's something that they need to be able to do. And so, if nothing else, I can tell them, hey, you are required to have these data for your students. So here's how to do this. And so, in theory, they would figure out that this is important for them, and then they would listen. Let's hope. And again, in this case, technology. What am I going to do for technology? Well, having them use Excel, having them use FitnessGram software, things like that, because they're essentially things that will kind of make their lives a little bit easier rather than having a million papers and paperwork and things like that. Using computer software will be a lot easier for them to collect their own data. The E is equipping students, helping them experience and explore different things. So, basically you see here, it's how will students uncover the meaning of the unit. So basically these are different activities that I'm going to have them do in order to have them, like it says, experience the different test items, just essentially what a testing session would look like. And then to kind of help them start figuring out test items that would be appropriate, and then writing a present level performance, all of these things. These are things they're going to have to be able to do on their own. And so, it's important that I teach them and give them the experience in a more controlled setting where it's just, maybe them with one student rather than them with a whole class of students, to where they can get really good at figuring out exactly what it is that they need to do without having the added stress of assessing, a whole entire class of students. The R is giving them the opportunity to rethink and revise. Again, this is something that every good teacher should do. It's not that, we just teach and, oh, well, that didn't go very well and forget about it and move on to the next class. Um, one thing that we encourage our student teachers to do is to reflect on their lessons. What went well? What didn't? What would you do differently next time? Um, because, that's important. If something didn't go well, if I had this great activity plan and it just totally bombed, then there is going to be no point in me actually trying to do that again if it's too complex for my students to understand. And so, giving the students the opportunity to um, look at their own videos or look at their own papers or, whatever it is that they've done for your assignments, and then giving them an opportunity to kind of revise things based on feedback you give them, based on peer feedback, those types of things are going to be very, very helpful to them. Um, the second E then is evaluate. And it's important to give the students formative feedback. So rather than just waiting and giving them feedback at the end, make sure you're giving them feedback all along. Maybe, things that I've done, having them turn in parts of an assignment rather than just wait and turn in the whole assignment at the end. In this case, I'm having them collect pre-test data. And then, from that, then they're going to be developing, kind of like a needs and abilities chart for their students. And then from that, then they would pick appropriate test items. And then they would have to write a present level of performance and analyze the data and all of those things. So, there's nothing to say that I couldn't have them turn in each component as they finish it to where I could give them feedback, because let's say that one of my students picked test items that are all wrong. Well, they're going to fail the assignment then. So giving them that formative feedback all along would be something that would be important. So that's just an example, but you can kind of again see here different types of things that I'll be doing to give them feedback for that class. T is tailored, and basically that means how you are going to personalize this unit for your students, something individualizing. That's something that's very important. Again, you have to remember that not every student learns the same. Some people might be great test takers, but they're not very good at projects or assignments. Some people, on the other hand, they might be great at doing projects, assignments, things that are not sitting down and actually taking a test because they have test anxiety. So, again, you can kind of see here where I have a lot of different things that my students are going to be able to do where they have a choice. They can kind of pick the test items that they want. There might be 20 different test items that are appropriate for, student A, but you don't need to do 20 different things. So, have them pick things that they like doing, that their students like to do, something that's easy, something that they actually have the equipment for, those kinds of things. So this is how I've tailored this to fit the needs of my students. And then the O of where to is organized. And in this case, we were trying to include technology. So the organization includes technology here in terms of, how I'm going to assess my students, how the students how this technology is going to help them become creative, think, at a higher level of learning, those types of things. And then again, we have our self-evaluation and peer evaluation. So that is essentially the understanding by design template in a very brief description.